Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be diving deep into a topic that is, well, I mean, it's tragic, but also super intriguing, right? Public perception of the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys probably already know the basics here, but the thing that's wild is how much public opinion changed after, after the assassination happened.
Yeah, it really is pretty fascinating. So we'll be looking at this using a 1998 article. It's from The Public Perspective, and that's a journal all about, public opinion research. And one thing the article points out, right away, is that for a lot of Americans, JFK's assassination was more than just like a political thing. It was really personal,
Yeah.
almost like they lost someone in their family.
Wow, yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So with that in mind, let's look at what happened right after. Polls show that it was pretty split. About half the people thought Oswald did it alone, and the other half thought it was a conspiracy. Seems pretty simple at first, right?
It does, yeah. But here's where things get interesting. So by the late 60s, belief in a conspiracy just totally exploded. We're talking like a jump from 25% to over 80% who thought there was more to the story. Think about it. In just a few years, belief in a conspiracy went from like 1 in 4 people to almost everybody, like 4 out of 5.
That's a huge change. Like, what could have caused something like that? Such a big shift in what people thought.
Well, there are probably a few things. The Warren Commission report, even though it was supposed to clear things up, actually made some people have even more questions. And this was all happening while the Vietnam War was going on, and people were starting to not trust the government as much.
So it was like all that stuff happening in the world at the same time made it easier for people to come up with other explanations, right?
Right.
People were already kind of questioning those in charge, and then this just added more fuel to the fire.
Exactly. And it wasn't just that people thought somebody else was involved. They had ideas about who it could be.
Okay, now this is the part that really gets me. So what kind of conspiracy theories popped up? Who were the main suspects people were thinking about?
Well, the article says that by 1966, polls already showed that most people thought others were involved in the assassination. And when they asked people to actually name names, some familiar faces or groups, I guess, came up a lot, like the CIA, the Mafia, even Fidel Castro.
So it's like all the big scary things from the Cold War, right? Espionage, organized crime, communist threats. It's almost like people took their fears and projected them onto this event, creating stories that fit how they already saw the world.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. And it makes you think, how much of what we believe is actually shaped by what we already think, even when it comes to these big historical events.
That's a great question to think about. But okay, before we get too deep into that, I'm curious about who was more likely to believe these conspiracy theories? Was it everyone, or were certain groups more into it than others?
That's where the research gets really interesting. They found a connection between people's political beliefs and whether they believed in a JFK conspiracy.
So you're saying that your political views could have affected how you saw the assassination. That's interesting. Tell me more.
Well, so while a lot of people from across the political spectrum believed in a conspiracy, it was way more common among those who had negative views of the government. Basically, the less someone trusted the system, the more likely they were to think there was something fishy about the official story.
It makes you wonder, is that distrust what leads to those beliefs, or is it the other way around? Do people who already distrust the government just naturally gravitate towards those kind of theories? Or does believing in conspiracies make that distrust even stronger?
That's a really good point, and it's something the researchers talked about too. Honestly, the article doesn't have a clear answer. But it does point to another connection that is interesting. They found that people who believed in a conspiracy were also more likely to be anxious about a lot of different things, like social and economic problems, even decades after the assassination.
So believing in a JFK conspiracy is connected to feeling more anxious about stuff like the economy or crime or global threats and things like that. Man, that brings up a lot more questions. So is it the belief itself that's causing the anxiety? Or is there something else deeper that makes people prone to both of those things, like believing in conspiracies and being more anxious? What do you think about that?
That's a tough one. I mean, it could be that the belief itself, the idea that these powerful forces are out there controlling things, is what makes people anxious. Makes sense, right? But then again, maybe there's something else going on that we're not seeing that leads to both of those things.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated thing, isn't it? And thinking about all this, it makes you wonder, if someone thinks the whole system is rigged against them, how does that affect how they actually engage with it,
That's a great point. Does it make them just not care? Become all cynical? Maybe even
completely withdraw from politics altogether?
Well, that's exactly what the researchers wanted to figure out, and what they found is actually kind of shocking. They called it the tuning out effect.
Tuning out. Okay, what does that even mean?
Basically, it means like disengaging, dropping out. The study found that people who believed in the JFK conspiracy, they were way less likely to vote in later elections, even like decades later.
So it's not just some idea in their head, right? It actually have real effects on how they participate, you know? Makes you think, if someone believes in one conspiracy, does that make them more likely to buy into others too? And like, if not trusting the system makes people tune out, could that like mess up democracy in the long run?
Whoa, those are some big questions there. But before we go too far down that road, let's circle back to the JFK assassination itself for a sec. Did anything actually change public opinion after all those investigations and reports came out?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too. You said earlier that even in 93, only 15% of people thought Oswald acted alone, and that's almost 30 years later.
Hmm.
Why do you think people kept believing in a conspiracy even though nothing new really came out, you know?
It almost seems like even with all the evidence they presented, the official explanations just didn't satisfy people. Like it didn't give them that feeling of closure or justice. Maybe they needed something more, like a story that could make sense of something so senseless.
Yeah, that makes sense. Something that fit better with their own experiences and how they saw the world.
Exactly. And once that story takes hold, it's really hard to change their minds, even when you show them evidence that says the opposite. For a lot of people, the JFK assassination just became a symbol of distrust, especially for those who felt like the official story left them out.
You know, you mentioned earlier that the people who believed in the conspiracy also said they felt more anxious about things like social and economic issues, even way after the assassination. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, the study found that these folks were much more likely to worry about things like, the economy being bad, crime rates being high, even the threat of nuclear war. And these anxieties, they stuck around for years and years.
Is there like a direct link between believing in the conspiracy and feeling that anxiety? Or could it be something else entirely? What do you think?
Man, that's a tough one. I mean, it could be that the belief itself, thinking that these powerful groups are out there pulling the strings, is what makes people anxious.
Right.
That would make sense, right? But it's also possible that there's something else deeper going on, something that makes people prone to both of those things, believing in conspiracies and having higher anxiety.
Like a chicken or the egg thing, huh? Like, which came first? It's hard to say for sure, but they definitely seem connected somehow. And it's not just something from the past, right? We see it happening today, too, with all the misinformation out there and people losing trust in institutions.
You're absolutely right. That's a great observation. It brings this whole conversation right into the present day. So as we think about this whole thing, the JFK assassination and how it affected people, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about some event from history. We're talking about human nature itself, about how we deal with information, how we wrestle with uncertainty, and how we try to find meaning in a world that can feel pretty chaotic and unfair at times.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been eye-opening, for sure. But before we wrap up, are there any other big takeaways from the research that you think are really important?
I think one of the biggest things is how strong those conspiracy theories are, how they just stick around. Once they take root in someone's mind, it's really hard to get rid of them, even when there's tons of evidence that says they're wrong.
Yeah, it's like they become part of how we remember things, how we understand the past.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be careful about the information we take in and to be aware of our own biases. We gotta be willing to question what we think we know and consider other viewpoints, even when they make us uncomfortable.
You know, that's a great point. And I think it's time to shift gears a bit and think about what this whole conversation tells us about ourselves, about society, and how we approach truth, power, and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of it all. It's crazy to think that even after all these years, decades, this one event still has such a grip on us.
Yeah, it really shows you how much we're drawn to mysteries and how much we need to understand why things happen, especially something as huge and tragic as this, right? But I think it also says something deeper about us, about how we see power, how we see truth, and how we build these stories to make sense of the world around us.
This deep dive has definitely shown that, yeah. We talked about how believing in a conspiracy kind of became the main story people told about the JFK assassination, and how that might have even affected how people thought about politics and participated in it. So, why do you think this one event, out of all of them, still keeps us so fascinated after all this time?
That's a really good question. I think part of it is just how big of a deal it was at the time. You had this young, popular president, and then suddenly he's gone, killed in his prime. It was like this huge loss of innocence and hope, especially for those who really loved Kennedy.
It must feel so surreal, right? Like something out of a movie, but it was actually happening. And it happened during such a crazy time in history, too.
Mm.
The Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War was on the horizon. It's almost like the assassination became this one point where all these fears and uncertainties that were already floating around just kind of crashed together.
That's a really interesting point. And I think when the official explanation, that lone gunman theory, didn't really address those fears, it left this kind of hole, and people tried to fill that hole with other explanations, things that made more sense to them.
So you're saying that these conspiracy theories kind of gave people a sense of order in a world that suddenly felt really chaotic and out of control.
Exactly. They offered a way for people to believe that there was some reason, some logic behind this event that just didn't make sense.
And I think all the unanswered questions about the assassination just made it worse, don't you think? Even with all the investigations and reports and everything, there were still things that didn't add up, things that nobody could really explain.
Absolutely. When you don't have clear answers, people naturally try to fill in the gaps themselves with their own ideas and theories. It's kind of like those ink blot tests. Everyone's looking at the same thing, but they see different things depending on what they already believe and what they've experienced.
This whole conversation has really highlighted how much our own perspectives shape what we see as true, right?
hmm
Like what we believe isn't always based on actual facts.
That's exactly why it's so important to be skeptical and to think critically about the information we get, especially now with all the fake news and everything going around. We have to be careful.
So true. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive here, I think the most important thing to remember is this. The JFK assassination is not just some event from the past. It's a reflection of who we are as people. It shows us our weaknesses, our fears, and how much we need to find meaning in a world that can be unpredictable and unfair.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And while we may never find all the answers, maybe the most important thing we can take away from this is the need to think for ourselves, to be open to different ideas, and to be willing to question even the things we think we already know.
Well said. And on that note, I'm going to leave you all with one last thought to chew on.
Yeah.
Do you think we, as a society, are more or less likely to believe in conspiracy theories now compared to back then in the 60s? And how much does this constant flood of information and misinformation play a role in shaping what we believe and how we see the world? Something to think about as you keep exploring this complex and fascinating event. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.